In this video, we're going to explore the charismatic movement. This is a movement within the church, post-1960s. Very specifically, this is focused on section E of the RS Educas syllabus, religious identity through religious experience. Focus of the syllabus then is the main beliefs within the charismatic movement, and then the implications for Christian practice in the experience of believers and Christian communities, and then look at philosophical challenges to that charismatic experience. Let's go back to this overview slide, which reminds us of just the whole process that we're looking at as the church moves from the splits, Great Schism, roughly 1000, 1500 Reformation, and then all that fragmentation in the Protestant church. And all that started then towards the end of the 19th century to see a reverse trend, and then through the 20th century is the period that we're looking at. And this section here on religious experience, and we're focusing on the charismatic movement within this. This is one of these bottom-up elements. That's what we've got. If we think about this, you've got these individual Christians who have this religious experience, this charismatic experience, which leads them to worship, to be a Christian in a particular way. And what that does is that unites them very closely with other people who've also had that charismatic experience and are living and worshipping as Christians in a particular way. And that unity of the charismatic experience transcends denominational boundaries. And so what you find is that these individuals, they will gather together at big, I don't know what you really call them, festivals, gatherings. Some of them are huge. They will take over an entire Butlins holiday camp for 3 weeks. There'll be thousands of people there. They'll take over showgrounds. There'll be some of it might be camping, and there'll be thousands of people there. There'll be teachers on in the main stages and in smaller groups, and those teachers will have that charismatic experience, but denominationally they will be from lots of different denominations. And the person that you're worshipping with in one of those big events, the person standing next to you, the people you listen to during the week, the people you discuss with, the people who are next in the next tent to you or the next chalet to you, they could be from completely different denomination, but you are united in this religious experience. And then how that works, as we've looked at this, those individuals who've had that, well, some of them are in fact leaders within the institutional churches, and so that moves us back up to that D level. And so those people in the institutional church who've had that charismatic experience are pretty keen then to bring together the denominations, because they see that their denominational label is less important than their experiential level of Christianity. And so then you get that top down where they are facilitating work between denominations, because denominations have ceased to matter. Now, it's also worth putting a rider in at this point that this is predominantly a move within Protestantism. There is some crossover between the charismatic movement in Roman Catholicism and Protestants, but certainly the charismatic movement has been a profoundly uniting influence in the Protestant tradition, rendering denominations all but irrelevant within that particular strand of Christianity, that charismatic revival. Let's look then at a key biblical passage. This is from St. Paul, and he talks about gifts of the Spirit, and that's what a lot of the focus of the charismatic movement is about. It's about what are seen as God, the Holy Spirit, in some way, language is difficult here, empowering them, filling them, reviving them, and giving them gifts, giving them a specific, sometimes specific abilities, and in other aspects of it are just manifestations of the Spirit. So this is Paul talking, writing to this the church in Corinth. So in the middle of the first century here. So this charismatic stuff is certainly not new. And here is Paul talking about it in this letter. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discernment of spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. Now, some of those in this list are fairly straightforward. The faith is pretty straightforward, but others are more miraculous. Working of miracles is specifically labelled there, and this prophecy, discernment of spirits, speaking in various kinds of tongues, an interpretation of tongues. So these are the more sort of weird supernatural type gifts, and it tends to be those which have taken prominence in the charismatic movement. And one of the problems in studying the charismatic movement is that it's not primarily intellectual at all. It's experiential, and so it's very much you start with the existential, and then you work out some theology that seems to explain that existential experience. Now, of course, if you've never been in one of these charismatic services, in fact you may not have any idea what they are. It's a bit difficult to just try and look at it theoretically. So what we're going to do now is just point you in the direction of some ways of trying to get it into what this modern charismatic worship, charismatic experience, charismatic churchmanship is all about. Modern music is a key element to it. It's a sort of, most of it's a sort of light rock genre, and Hillsong is it's more than a band. It's a sort of, it's a music ministry is probably how it would be described. And watching some of these videos, loads of them on YouTube, will give you a flavour of what it's like. A lot of the charismatic movement is about these big events, and so you've got thousands of people, great light show, music, and so watch some of these. There's you can either just check out Hillsong Worship channel on YouTube, and I'll put some links in the description below, where you can just check out what they are like. And there's lots of them, but Hillsong are a very good, very polished music ministry, and you get a feel of what some of those big charismatic events are like. Of course, most charismatic worship is not in those huge events. People like to go to those. So if you're a charismatic Christian, you're probably going to at least one of those type huge events each year. But the local church tries to emulate that just on a local level, Sunday by Sunday in their services. How effectively they deliver that depends on the quality of musicianship and general sort of technical ability within the church. But a lot of these churches, they've got very strong numbers. There's lots of young, pretty savvy people. and there tends to be enough money, so a lot of even a fairly small church can deliver quite effectively. And very importantly, about the crossing denominations. Now, a very dynamic church within the Church of England is Holy Trinity Brompton. It could be perceived as the most dynamic church in the Church of England, and has got lots and lots of influence throughout the church, throughout UK. It's something worth looking at. Have a look at, so just look at the website. There we go, www.htb.org. Now, one of the questions to ask as you look at the Holy Trinity Brompton website, that's Church of England, and in fact you can see in the graphic that I've put in the screen there, is fairly obvious. It's a Church of England church. I mean, it looks like it. You can see it's got an east window. You can see the arches with those going into the side aisles. And if you look at it from outside, it's a standard London church. And outside, it just looks like an ordinary Church of England church. Inside, you'd probably think it doesn't look anything like your standard Church of England church. But have a look at, and as you're looking at that, the main thing to do is to say to yourself, what's the question? Why are people attracted to that sort of church? What's going on? The intellectual bit comes second. It's existential first, which is a major problem, because at the moment what we're doing is analysing this at an intellectual, at a theoretical level. There's always a problem there when you try and just reduce the experiential, the existential, and you try and just reduce it to a list of propositional statements, because if you're doing that, you're actually missing 95% of what's going on for the people involved, which isn't about propositional statements at all. It is about the existential. It's about participating in that event. It's about the relationships there. It's about feelings, it's about emotions, and it is just about the totality of the human person living out their Christian faith within community. So always be aware of the dangers of reducing that to a list of propositional statements, which are then going to be evaluated. Now, speaking in tongues and singing in tongues, this is a fairly significant, it's found in some strands of the charismatic movement. It's pretty major. This speaking in tongues is pretty weird to people who've not encountered it, and I'm not going to try and explain it. The easiest way again is just to point you to some illustrations on YouTube of what this is. I've put them on the screen here, and I'll put them in the description below. I'll put these links in. And again, the important thing is this is not it's not just a sort of one size fits all, and so you go from what you would probably consider to be just some pretty weird and wacky American American Pentecostals who, you know, you might feel really uncomfortable looking at it, and then you've got Justin Welby. You know, you can't get more respectable than the Archbishop of Canterbury. He just very factually, very practically, very ordinary fashion talks about praying in tongues. So there's no one size fits all for this. You've got this within the Roman Catholic tradition. You've got it in the sort of, you know, the very traditional American fundamentalist Protestant. You've got it in the modern charismatics we've just seen in Holy Trinity Brompton, young, sophisticated, modern Londoners, most of the people who go to that church. So it is, again, this is one of the things about the charismatic movement, is it crosses all denominational lines, which of course is why it's so powerful in terms of the unifying within the Christian church, and that bringing back together of those divisions. And as you can see in this here, this is even uniting across that Catholic Protestant split. Now, of course, as this is looked at and we're evaluating this and analysing it, then it's well, what explanations are there for what is going on in this? Now, very important to look at axioms here. If in fact you're approaching this as a philosophical materialist, then in fact you're going to look at what would be described as purely psychological explanations for it. As soon as you're not a philosophical materialist and you've got some sort of even minimal sense that there is something beyond what we would normally call the physical, that there is some sort of a divine spirit, God, then that immediately opens up the idea that what might be going on here is these people are somehow encountering that the spiritual, the non-physical, the mysterious, something other. They're encountering that in a way that opens up ways of being which aren't normally available to us, put it that way. And at another level, you could say, well, this is actually the standard way of expressing this in Christianity, is say this is God from the outside, sort of entering the person in the power of the Holy Spirit and changing them, and then manifesting that change, and the Spirit speaking through, worshipping through that individual, using this what's known as tongues, glossolalia to be technical. We're going to have a look now at the historical developments of this. The historical developments, as we've already referenced, go back to the first century within the Christian church, and if you go back into the Old Testament within the Judeo-Christian tradition, you've got accounts in the Old Testament of Saul, King Saul, and the prophets, and talking about them prophesying, and it's pretty obvious that they're describing something that fits very well with what you see in those charismatic churches, those Pentecostal churches. And so it's been around. This has been around thousands of years. Nothing modern about it at all. We're looking particularly at the modern charismatic movement and its influence on unification. And so that particular strand of what we're calling the charismatic movement, we need to go back to the early 20th century. And of course, this is again in that period that we're really interested in. At tail end of the 19th century, things began to change, and then early 20th century, and particularly in America for this bit that we're looking at, is very important. We're going to look at two characters then. These both American. One is Charles Fox Parham, and the other, it's not so much the individual, it's the church that is relevant here, which is the Azusa Street. And so this is known as the Azusa Street Revival, and that's in Los Angeles. Let's start then with Charles Fox Parham, and from him we need to just dip back a little bit earlier to give us a better context. So Fox Parham, then, you can see he spans that end of the 19th century into the 20th. He's described as independent, so he's not got a particular denominational allegiance. He's not sort of paid by a denominational body, so he's not a minister of the Baptist Church. He's not a minister of the Methodist Church or the Church of England. He's just he really just works on his own. Christian who has decided what he's going to do is an evangelist, itinerant. It means he wanders around, and so he travels around finding people to teach, finding people to preach to, and churches would invite him to speak, to preach at their services or their Bible studies or at church meetings. Now, the important bit here is that he is within what's known as the holiness tradition, and that is a tradition which it feeds very much into this charismatic movement. He believed very strongly in divine healing, so that's that sort of charismatic gifts. And very importantly, Fox Parham is somebody who has talking about speaking in tongues, and saw that as a very important element, and that is the evidence for reception of this baptism with the Holy Spirit. And the important thing about speaking in tongues is it's pretty weird, and it's quite distinct. So therefore, all these other elements of the sort of gifts of the Spirit look in many ways fairly normal. They might just be a little bit, slightly different to the way most people in most churches are working. But as soon as you start speaking in tongues, that really marks you out as different. So we need to look a little bit at this holiness movement to see how this shaped the charismatic movement. The important element in the holiness movement is this concept of second work of grace, sometimes a second blessing, and that being central to being a Christian. In the context that this is developing, there wasn't really any concept of somebody who was not a Christian. If you lived in Europe or America, where much of this is going on, then you were a Christian, or you were a Jew if you lived in one of those Jewish communities, but they were fairly irrelevant, really. And so the idea here is that everybody is a Christian, everybody's been baptized, everybody shows up at church periodically. When they get married, they're going to get married in church, etc. The holiness movement was about saying that that's not enough. You can't just be a sort of cultural Christian. There's got to be some clear evidence of this, of being a Christian. And this is where the second work of grace came in. So the idea is that you are a Christian, you're baptized as a baby, confirmed, etc. But then at some point you're going to have, and this is the important bit, it's an existential element to your Christianity. You have some sort of profound experience later in life where you have a sense of meeting with God in a very real way and are profoundly changed by it. Now, as the holiness movement went into the Pentecostal charismatic movement, then that profound experience later in life, which you needed to be a genuine Christian, was linked very closely with speaking in tongues. And so really that fed into the charismatic movement through the Pentecostal movement, with a sense of, yes, okay, you've been baptized, but you have to have this meeting with God in a very powerful and profound way, changing you to an existential level. And how do we know that's happened? You're going to speak in tongues. And a key player in this was John Wesley. Now, Wesley was not merely baptized and, sort of cultural Christian, vaguely living as a Christian. No, Wesley was an ordained Anglican minister when he had his second blessing, that existential encounter with God. Wesley is a very key player. It was the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who founded the Methodist Church. And so a pretty significant pair of Church of England clergymen who their work then spawned the Methodist Church, which has been in its time a fairly significant denomination. And this is how Wesley described this event. And it was an event, he dates it. And he says, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone, for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. At the point that Wesley had that experience, he's just in a Bible study, he's reading Luther, so he's reading a theology book and he encountered God. The crucial thing about this is not an intellectual engagement with Luther, it's not an intellectual engagement with St. Paul's letter to the Romans. This is at an existential level. This is as far back as we're going to go in this history, but this is the in many ways, if you're going to have an origin of the holiness movement, it's the Wesleys. And this feeds on then through the 19th century and into the Pentecostal movement, and then into the Charismatic movement. Now, very significant in the Pentecostal revival was this church in Los Angeles, the Azusa Street Church. And very significant, I mean, just the fact that this is early 20th century, and it was a church which had both African Americans and whites worshipping together. Now, if you bear in mind that it was only in 1865, at the end of the American Civil War, that slavery was abolished, this is not that long after that. And so you've got those deep divisions still there. This was segregation era, and yet this was a church where you would go in and you would find a mixed black and white congregation. That's pretty radical for the time. This church was defying these social and cultural and political norms, which were all about racial segregation. Now, very important, this is William Seymour, who is the minister, and the services there were a pattern that was very much then absorbed into that Pentecostal tradition. No formal structure to the service. People preached and testified and the way they would put it, as they were moved by the Spirit. And very importantly, we've got this speaking and singing in tongues, and also falling in the Spirit, which is a sort of passing out in a swoon. This was incredibly significant. This was a revival. You have churches still have these missions when you'll for a week they'll have a special preacher come in. They'll invite lots of people in, and usually these things last for about a week. This went on for years, and it was significant because there were the number of people who were involved. The media noticed it, the secular media. It was presented in newspapers, which then meant that even more people turned up. And so what's happening here is people are arriving at the Azusa Street Church, and they're coming from all sorts of different denominations, different parts of the country. They were influenced by this. They had this second blessing experience. They potentially started speaking in tongues, and then they went back. And so they went back to their own churches of all sorts of different denominations, and then took some of those patterns from Azusa Street back to those churches. And so that was a great way of spreading that Pentecostal model. The incredible feature of the Pentecostal type services is this lack of formal structure. Just a personal anecdote. I remember the first time that I encountered this. This was Saltley Baptist Church in Birmingham, and this would have been in the 70s. And I was a lay preacher at that stage, not in the Church of England. And I was just preaching at this church. It was just given me as a church, go and take the service at this church on Sunday morning. Phoned up somebody from the church to get some guidance and what the hymns were, that sort of thing. And he said, turn up. He said, bring a sermon, maybe choose a hymn, and maybe a prayer. And I thought, this service is going to last about 15 minutes. Well, what I hadn't realised was that this church, which was about 50% black, then what they'd done, the black elements in the congregation had in fact sort of converted the white people to be honorary black people in church. And so this service went on for well over an hour because I was close to irrelevant. They chose the hymns, they sang, they did their own praying. The Bible reading that I'd chosen was read. I preached a sermon, but very noticeable during the sermon. It was one of those sort of almost cliched black churches where they shouted out through the sermon They shouted "Amen," and which is quite encouraging, really, because you normally, as a preacher standing in front of a congregation where you're not entirely sure whether they're awake. But this lot clearly were. They were not only awake, they were clearly listening and fully engaged with what I was saying. Now that wasn't it wasn't quite as far down the line as the Azusa Street revival of the Pentecostals. There was no praying in tongues, but certainly in the time of prayer, instead of it just being me reading the formal prayers that I'd written out beforehand and turned up with on a piece of paper, the prayers were, it was me saying, we'll now have a time of prayer, so I introduced it, and then the members of the congregation just got up and prayed spontaneously in that, and so it was quite a lengthy time. So very, many ways, sort of anti-clerical. In many ways, I wasn't actually ordained at that stage, but I was a formally qualified lay preacher. But this lot could have quite happily got on. If no minister had turned up, they possibly wouldn't have even noticed. And so that's that idea of the it's a declericalizing movement. It's a movement of the people. God is encountering people, and they are able to speak through the Spirit, is the idea within this. And again, it's got to be understood at an existential level. It's incredibly difficult to study this movement just as an academic exercise from the outside. We're looking at the charismatic movement in terms of its unification of the church. And so as we look at the strengths and weaknesses of that, there's two elements to it. One is its profound importance in uniting Christians, going right back to that slide at the beginning about that movement of the bottom-up movement, where Christians who experience that unity at these big charismatic events, and the charismatic experience being far more important than denominational allegiance, is clearly a profoundly uniting factor. There's a weakness to that, however, because there's a tendency in some areas within the charismatic movement that it just creates a different division. Remembering back to that holiness movement concept, that what you can then end up with is Christians who've had this second blessing, who've had this Pentecostal experience, who are members of the charismatic movement, and very particularly those who speak in tongues, just then simply form another faction. And so you then have got a division between those Christians that speak in tongues, the proper Christians, and those Christians who don't speak in tongues, who are considered then to be some sort of second-class citizen. Another element as we analyse the charismatic movement is what is the source of it. I already mentioned the fact that, to state the obvious, depends on what your axioms are as to what the options here will be. So if you're coming at this as a philosophical materialist, you've got no God, spiritual, spirit, divine, you've got nothing like that at all. And therefore the only possible explanation is what we will call natural. And so therefore you do this all in terms of purely sociological and psychological terms. Now, of course, if you are somebody who's willing to accept the spiritual God type explanations, then in fact you've got another layer here that doesn't remove the psychological and the sociological. So there's plenty within the Christian church who have done plenty of analysis of the charismatic movement, and that psychological and sociological explanations for a lot of the aspects of it is open within that. But also, of course, they've got the option of saying, actually, what we've got here is something that God is giving, that at least some of the people experiencing this charismatic renewal are genuinely expressing gifts given by God, that words are given by God, and that they have been given the power of God to perform healings and other miracles. And this, of course, then links us into what are often seen as separate strands of study, and that is the whole concept of miracles and the miraculous, and the whole study of religious experience. And so the charismatic movement has got to be set within those other studies.